The winter that year arrived without announcement. It did not come with frost on the hedgerows or the slow yellowing of the last leaves. It came instead as a kind of silence, a complete and absolute withdrawal of warmth from the county of Wiltshire, as though the earth itself had decided it was done with comfort and had closed its doors. The road to Ashverne Park cut through 3 miles of bare oak and naked elm, and in the grey morning light of early December, those trees stood like men who had forgotten what it meant to be alive. The park wall was old limestone, the kind that went dark when it was wet, and it had been wet for 11 days without pause. There was 1 chimney smoking at Ashverne Park. 1 out of 7. The east wing was shuttered entirely, every window blind with closed panels, and the iron gate at the lower drive bore a length of chain that had rusted at the links into something that looked less like a lock and more like a wound. The garden between the south face and the ha-ha had not been touched in what the village said was 2 years, and the rose beds there had grown upward and outward and over themselves until they formed a kind of wall of their own, thorned and tangled and very dark. No one walked in it. No one had opened the gate in that garden wall since the last Duchess of Ashverne had died on a Thursday morning in April, 18 months before, with the window open and the smell of the first cutting of grass coming in from the lawns. The room was still warm when they found her. The fire had not been let out. The chair was still turned toward the window. That detail had travelled through the county with the speed that only grief and scandal can manage, and it had arrived ahead of every other fact, so that when people spoke of Ashverne now, they did not speak of its architecture or its parkland or the 8,000 acres of productive farmland that stretched southeast toward the river. They spoke of a duke who had not, in 18 months, opened the east wing, or lit more than 1 chimney, or been seen at any social occasion longer than was strictly required by the terms of his title. His name was Edmund Cavendish Hartwell, 6th Duke of Ashverne, and he was 34 years old, and he had been described by the 3 counties, who felt they had some claim on his reputation as cold, as proud, as inconsolable, as difficult, and once, in a letter that had made a considerable circuit of the drawing-rooms of Wiltshire, as a man who has forgotten that the living have any rights worth considering. He had read that letter. He had not responded to it. He was seated at the desk in the 1 warm room in the house, the library on the ground floor, whose fire was the source of the single thread of smoke that rose from the only active chimney, when his steward entered and placed a letter on the edge of the desk with the careful silence of a man who had learned exactly how much noise to make. Edmund looked at it. He did not pick it up. "Whom does it come from?" he said. Not a question, a statement in the shape of one. "Lord Sedbourne, your grace, concerning the matter of the charity subscription for the village school." Edmund's left hand moved from the desk to the arm of the chair. "And the matter of Miss Sedbourne." His steward did not answer. That was answer enough. Edmund picked up the letter. He read it in the time it takes a clock to tick 8 times. He had learned to read very quickly after Catherine died, because reading quickly meant spending less time alone with the quality of the silence in any given room. Lord Sedbourne's letter was 4 paragraphs. The first concerned the school subscription. The second raised, with excessive delicacy, the subject of the duchy, requiring an heir. The third mentioned his eldest daughter, Miss Honoria Sedbourne, who was accomplished and well regarded, and had been told very often that she would make an exceptional duchess. The fourth was a postscript about the charity subscription again, as though Sedbourne thought Edmund might forget that the social obligation and the matrimonial suggestion were intended to be read as separate. Edmund set the letter down. His right hand moved to the edge of the desk and stayed there, not gripping, simply resting. A ship at anchor in weather it does not trust. He had known this would come. The steward had known it was coming. The county had been discussing the probability of it for 6 months, at minimum, and the conclusion they had collectively reached was that the Duke of Ashverne must remarry, must produce an heir, must cease the quiet and somehow insulting practice of grieving at a volume that made everyone around him uncomfortable. He understood that. He had even, in the colder hours of early morning, when the library fire had gone to coals and the dark outside was complete, agreed with it in the way one agrees with an arithmetic problem, as a truth that carries no warmth. He wrote back to Sedborn within the hour. He accepted the charity subscription. He declined, in 3 words, the other suggestion. Then he wrote a second letter to his solicitor in Bath, because there was a second name on his list, a name that had been given to him by his solicitor 4 months ago, and that he had placed in a drawer and not opened since. He opened it now. Miss Cecily Wren, 23 years of age, daughter of the late Reverend Edmund Wren of Dorset and his widow, Mrs. Wren, no dowry to speak of, no connections of consequence. No beauty reported, which the solicitor had included not as cruelty, but as a kind of reassurance. Edmund had specified, with a bluntness that had given the solicitor pause, that he had no use for a beautiful wife. Beauty, in his experience, attracted attention, and attention was the thing he had least patience for. He wanted quiet. He wanted competence. He wanted someone who would leave him alone in his library and would manage Ashverne's household and would understand without being told that this was a practical arrangement, not a love match, and that the east wing would remain closed. He did not think of Cecily Wren again until the afternoon his steward informed him that she had arrived. She came in a hired coach, not a private carriage, a detail the housekeeper reported to the steward, and the steward reported to Edmund with the neutral expression of a man transmitting information he has been asked not to evaluate. The coach had cost 7 shillings from the last posting in, which meant she had either refused to accept the travel funds Edmund's solicitor had offered, or had not received them in time. Edmund noted this without comment. He was still in the library when she was shown in. She stood in the doorway for exactly 2 seconds before she stepped across the threshold. He registered this, that she had paused not from hesitation, but from some kind of internal calibration, as though she were taking the measure of the room before entering it. She was not tall. She wore a grey wool dress, the collar of which had been turned and re-sewn at some recent point, the new thread a half-shade darker than the original. Her hair was brown, and pinned without fuss. Her eyes were the precise colour of river water in November, neither green nor grey, but somewhere between them, that changed depending on where the light fell. She did not curtsy immediately. She looked at him first. Edmund was not accustomed to being looked at by women who were about to curtsy. He was accustomed to women looking at the floor, or the ceiling, or a point approximately 18 inches to his left, as though direct eye contact with a duke carried some physical risk. This one looked at him the way a person looks at a door they are about to open, with assessment, not with awe. Then she curtsied. "Your Grace, Miss Wren." He did not stand. "Sit down." She sat. She chose the chair nearest the fire, and she sat in it with a straightness that was not performance. She did not straighten her spine to show him she had good posture, She simply sat in the way of a person whose spine had learned to support itself without assistance. Her hands were folded in her lap. There was a small ink stain on the outer edge of her right forefinger, old enough to have faded to a watermark. He said, "You understand the nature of this arrangement. I understand that you require a wife for practical purposes, and that I am being considered for the position." The word position. He noticed it. He said, "You make it sound like employment. Is it not?" She looked at him without challenge, only with something that might have been curiosity. "I manage a household in exchange for the protection of the title and the security of a settled income. You receive a duchess and an heir, God willing, and the county ceases to discuss your domestic arrangements. It seems to me a contract of mutual benefit. I would simply prefer to know its terms clearly from the beginning." 1 second. 2, 3. Edmund looked at her. He had prepared himself for tears. He had prepared for ambition, dressed as modesty, for the particular performance of reluctance that concealed eagerness. He had not prepared for this, for a woman who used the word contract in her second sentence and meant it without apology. He said, "The east wing remains closed." "Of course," she said, as though this were the most ordinary instruction a man had ever given. "I will not discuss my first marriage. I would not ask you to. You will have full management of the household and the accounts. I require only that things run quietly." She nodded once. Then she said, "I have one condition." His chin came up by perhaps half an inch. "You have a condition. I would like access to the library." She glanced at the shelves, then back at him. Her eyes did not apologize. "I was told the collection is considerable. If I am to live here for the remainder of my life, I would prefer to live with books." He looked at her for 4 seconds. Then he said, "The library is open to you." She said, "Thank you, Your Grace." And that was that. They were married 12 days later in the chapel at Ashverne, with the steward and the housekeeper as witnesses, and a fire that had been lit especially for the occasion, and that smelled of coal and damp stone, and something underneath both of those things that might have been, on a different day, hope. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The county noticed, as the county always notices. The news travelled in that particular way of a thing that has been expected so long that its arrival is simultaneously unsurprising and electrifying, like a thunderstorm that has been building since noon and still makes everyone flinch when it finally breaks. There were 2 reactions, running parallel. The first was relief. The Duke of Ashverne had done the sensible thing, the necessary thing, the right thing. Ashverne needed a duchess and an heir, and the reopening of those shuttered windows. The second reaction arrived approximately 48 hours behind the first, carried in the letters and morning calls of a particular stratum of Wiltshire society, and it was somewhat less charitable. Her name was Lady Dorothea Holt, widow of Sir Clement Holt, and cousin of the former Duchess of Ashverne. She was 41 years old, and she had been Catherine Hartwell's closest companion for 22 of those years, which meant she had watched Catherine grow from a girl into a duchess, and had measured her own consequence against that proximity with the care of a person who understands that their social standing is a structure built on someone else's foundation. When Catherine died, Dorothea had lost more than a friend. She had lost her position in the hierarchy of every important drawing room in the county. She had been, for 18 months, the keeper of Catherine's memory, and that role, carried with a grief that was real, and a self-importance that was equally real, and somewhat more visible, had given her a platform she had no intention of surrendering. She wrote 12 letters in the 48 hours after the announcement of Edmund's remarriage. She called on 6 families. She attended a card party at the Rutherfords, and she sat beside Mrs. Rutherford for 1 hour and 40 minutes. And she said, among other things, of course one understands the necessity, but a reverend's daughter, with no family, no portion, no connections whatever, it is very nearly a charity case, is it not? One wonders if he simply took the first name his solicitor produced. This sentence travelled. In the manner of sentences of this type, it shed its context along the way, and retained only its sharpest element, so that by the time it had reached the 3rd house and the 6th retelling, it had condensed itself into something simpler and more damaging. The charity case bride of Ashverne. Cecily heard it on a Tuesday morning in January, when she was in the village to speak with the schoolmaster about the subscription Edmund had agreed to fund. She heard it from a shopkeeper's wife, who had not meant her to hear it, and who went pale when she realized Cecily was standing 3 feet away at the counter. Cecily bought her thread, dark brown, 4 spools, which was what she had come for, and she paid for it, and she said good morning, and she walked back to Ashverne in the cold with the spools in her pocket, and her hands in her gloves, and her jaw set at an angle that had nothing to do with the wind. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. She had learned it at 14, when her father died and left them with the house in Dorset, and the books, and £200, and no more. And she had cried for 2 days, and at the end of the 2 days, the situation was identical in every particular to what it had been at the beginning. After that, she had developed a rule: weep privately if you must, but never in front of the problem. She had not wept in 3 years. She did not weep now. What she did was this. She went to the library. The library at Ashverne had not been properly used in 18 months. The housekeeper had dusted it mechanically, but the books had sat unread, and the fire had been lit only when Edmund was in the room, and the long table at the centre, which could seat 14 at full extension, had gathered a quality of emptiness that felt less like furniture and more like a reproach. Cecily had been in it every day since her arrival, not in any dramatic or demonstrative way, but simply because she had been told she could use it, and she intended to. She had begun pulling books from the shelves in the East End, the end farthest from Edmund's desk, and reading them in the chair near the window that caught the afternoon light. On that Tuesday, she did not read. She sat in the chair with the spools in her lap, and she looked out at the garden with its tangle of unpruned roses, and she thought about the phrase charity case, and she thought about what it meant, and what it did not mean, and what she intended to do about it. The answer, she decided, was nothing dramatic. The answer was to be so thoroughly, so quietly, so undeniably good at the thing she had agreed to do that the phrase would eventually become absurd when applied to her. She could not control what Dorothea Holt said. She could control whether or not the village school had its subscription paid on time, whether the Ashverne household accounts were in order, whether the tenants' repairs were seen to before the worst of the winter, and whether the library, which had been slowly closing in on itself like a room that has given up on being inhabited, became a room that was alive again. She began, the next morning, by speaking to the head gardener about the rose beds. The head gardener was a man of 60, named Briggs, who had served at Ashverne for 31 years, and who regarded the new duchess with the particular wariness of a man who has watched one duchess die and is not in any hurry to invest himself in another. He listened to Cecily's questions, with his arms crossed, and his eyes on the ground, and he gave short answers in the manner of someone who is being economical with information not from rudeness, but from a kind of self-protection, the same way one is careful with a fire one has been burned by before. She did not take offence. She asked which of the rose beds along the south wall could be brought back before spring, if the pruning began now. Briggs said 3, possibly 4, if it didn't come on to freeze before March. She said she would like those 4 done first. He looked at her then, not for long, just for a moment. She had the sense that she had said something unexpected, though she could not have said precisely what. Those were her Grace's roses, he said. Not accusation, just information. I know, she said. That is not a reason to let them die. Briggs went home that evening and told his wife that the new Duchess was either very wise or very foolish, and that he was not yet certain which, but that she had asked the right questions and had not flinched when he mentioned the late Duchess by implication, which was more than most people managed. Edmund noticed the rose beds on a morning in late January, when he walked the south terrace for the first time in longer than he wished to calculate. The gardeners were working, 3 of them, with the careful, systematic progress of people who have been given clear instructions and adequate time. The thorned overgrowth was being cut back in sections, not hacked, taken apart methodically. The dead canes removed first, and the living ones bent back and trained along the wall with lengths of twine. It was not yet beautiful, but it was clearly in the process of becoming something. He stood at the terrace railing for 6 minutes. Then he went back inside. He said nothing to Cecily about the roses that day. But at dinner that evening, they had fallen into the habit of dining together in the smaller of the 2 dining rooms, which had 1 chimney and a table that had been reduced from its full extension to a length suitable for 4. He looked up from his plate once and almost said something. The words arrived at his lips and withdrew. His hand moved from his knife to the edge of the table and back. Almost. He did not speak, but the dinner lasted 3 minutes longer than usual, and he was the one who did not rise first. February brought a cold that settled into the stone of Ashverne so deeply that the interior walls grew damp to the touch in the early mornings, and the housekeeper could be heard at dawn making her rounds with a lamp, checking which fireplaces had gone cold in the night and which had held. Cecily rose each morning at 6, before the house was entirely awake, and she went first to the library, not because there was work to do there at 6 in the morning, but because the library fire was the first one lit, and she had discovered, in the slow accumulation of weeks at Ashverne, that the hours before the house had opinions about her were the hours in which she felt most entirely herself. She would read for 40 minutes and drink the tea the kitchen boy left outside the door on a tray, and by the time the household was in motion, she had already been alone with her thoughts for long enough that she did not need to defend them. It was in those mornings that she had first truly read Catherine's library. Not the spines, not the titles, but the annotations, the tiny marginal notes in pencil and books of poetry and natural history and correspondence that told her who Catherine had been when she was not being a duchess. She had underlined a line in a collection of letters about grief. The difficulty is not the loss itself, but the space the lost person leaves in every ordinary object. Someone, Catherine, it must have been Catherine, had written in the margin beside this line, in handwriting that was small and very precise, "Yes, exactly, yes." Cecily read that marginal note 4 times. Then she closed the book and put it back on the shelf, and did not take it down again for a week. When she did not read the marked passage. She read around it, in the pages before and after, as though approaching something that needed to be given room. She had not told Edmund about the annotations. She did not know how to tell him without it sounding like a report, and she did not want to give him a report on his first wife's inner life in the way of a person who has found a document and is handing it over. She simply left those books where they were, in the positions on the shelves where they had presumably always stood, and she understood from them something about Catherine Hartwell that no living person had told her. That she had been a woman who thought precisely and felt deeply, and who was not afraid of either of those things. This did not make Cecily feel inadequate, as perhaps it should have, as perhaps Dorothea Holt intended it to. It made her feel, instead, a kind of retroactive kinship with a woman she would never meet, the kinship of two people who have read the same books and marked the same passages, even if years apart, even without knowing the other had passed that way before. It was Dorothea Holt who forced the first real fracture into the surface of those quiet weeks. She appeared at Ashverne on a grey Wednesday in February. Unannounced, under the pretense of dropping off a charitable subscription she claimed to have been holding since before Christmas. She was shown into the morning room where Cecily was reviewing the household accounts, and she sat down in the chair opposite, and she looked at the books spread open on the desk, and the inkwell, and the column of figures in Cecily's handwriting, and she said, with a smile that was perfectly warm and perfectly incorrect, "How very industrious you are." Cecily set down her pen. "Lady Holt, this is unexpected. I hope not unwelcome." Dorothea set an envelope on the edge of the desk. "The subscription. I should have sent it sooner, but one finds the months moving so quickly. How are you finding Ashverne? I imagine it must seem very large and very quiet for someone who—" She paused, then completed the sentence with a care that was almost surgical, "for someone newly arrived." Cecily looked at her. She was quiet for a moment in the way of a person doing arithmetic. "It is large," she said, "and I find quiet rather congenial." Dorothea's eyes moved around the room, registering the accounts book, the neatly stacked correspondence, the small fire that was burning, because Cecily had asked for one when she began work that morning. The fire was new. The morning room had not, according to the housekeeper, had a fire lit in it since before Catherine's death. She always preferred this room in the mornings, Dorothea said. It was not clear which chair she was referring to, or which room, or which fire. It was perfectly clear what she was referring to. Cecily said, "It is a good room. I am glad to have found it." Dorothea left 23 minutes later. She had gotten nothing she had come for, no visible distress, no sign of insecurity or awkwardness. Nothing that could be carried back to the drawing rooms and translated into confirmation. She had left with the subscription receipt, and a cup of tea that Cecily had ordered brought in with a calm that had been faintly infuriating. And she sat in her carriage on the way home with a sense of dissatisfaction that she did not examine very carefully, because to examine it would have required acknowledging what she had actually been hoping to find. She had been hoping to find Catherine diminished by comparison. What she had found instead was a woman who ran her own mourning and did not apologize for it, and this was, if anything, worse. It was in March that Cecily found the portrait. She had not been looking for it. She had been in the long gallery on the first floor, which she used twice a week as a route between the library and the linen room, and she had noticed a door at the far end that she had always seen closed. On that particular morning in March, it was open by approximately 4 inches. A draught, or a housemaid who had forgotten, or simply the way old houses breathe. She pushed it open. It was a sitting room, small, with a low ceiling and a window that faced the garden. The furniture was covered in Holland cloth, every piece, The fire had not been set in this room in a very long time. The grate was cold, and the ash in it was old ash. The kind that has settled and compacted, and is no longer dust but something harder. On the wall opposite the window, uncovered and unhung, leaning against the wainscoting at a slight angle, was a portrait. It was Catherine. Cecily had not seen her before, not in any picture, not in any description precise enough to constitute a face. But she knew instantly, the way one knows the subject of a portrait from the painting itself, from the way it had been composed, and the attention that had been placed in every detail of the face. She had been dark-haired and very beautiful, and she had been painted, Cecily thought, somewhere in her late 20s, and she had been painted by someone who admired her genuinely, which meant that whatever was in the portrait was probably true. She had a kind of warmth in the line of her mouth, not a smile exactly, but the precondition for one, and her eyes were direct and certain and very much alive. The room was cold. Cecily stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she pulled the door gently closed and walked back the way she had come. She was in the library that evening when Edmund came in, later than usual, with the particular quality of tiredness that is not physical. He stopped when he saw her. She was in her usual chair at the far end, near the window, with a book open and a candle on the table beside her, and the fire at her back threw her shadow long across the floor. He said, "I did not know you were here. I often am at this hour," she said. "I can go if you prefer." He said nothing for a moment. Then he crossed the room to his desk and sat. He opened a letter and read it, though she had the impression he was not reading it with the part of his mind that actually understood words. After a long time he said, without looking up, "I found the portrait room open." A beat. "2, I am sorry," she said. "I did not mean to intrude. You did not intrude." He set the letter down. His hands were on the desk, and one of them, the right, moved very slightly toward the center of the desk, and then stopped. She should have been remembered better than that. Left on the floor of a closed room. Cecily was quiet. She turned a page in her book that she was not reading. Edmund said she was 29 when she died. We had been married for 4 years. She did not say she was sorry. She did not say she understood. She said she looked like a person who was easy to love. He was still for a long moment. His shoulders dropped by a fraction of an inch. Not a collapse, but a release. The kind that happens when a person has been holding themselves to attention for so long that the body finally forgets to maintain it. "She was," he said. They sat in the library for another hour and a half. He did not speak again, and neither did she. But when Cecily left, she noticed that he had moved a candle from the corner of his desk to the nearer edge of it, so that the room was a little brighter. The portrait was hung the following week. Not in the gallery, not prominently, in a room at the end of the first-floor corridor that had good light from the east window in the mornings. Edmund supervised it himself. When it was up, he stood in front of it for a long time and said nothing. Cecily, passing in the corridor, slowed her step and then continued on, because some silences are not hers to enter. The almost moments began compounding in April. Cecily had taken to leaving tea at the edge of Edmund's desk when she passed through the library in the mornings, not with ceremony, simply setting it down as she walked by with whatever she was carrying to the next task. He had not asked her to. She had not announced the intention. It had simply become a habit, the kind that installs itself so quietly in a household that no one can say exactly when it began. He almost thanked her the first time. The words formed and he looked down at the desk. The second time, she was passing back through when he said, "It is too cold in the morning to come without a shawl." She had been without one. She stopped, and he was already looking back at his work, and almost, very nearly, she had thought she detected something in his voice that was not instruction. The third time was in the garden. Briggs had reported in late April that 2 of the 4 rose beds were showing new growth, strong growth, not the tentative pushing through of a plant still deciding whether to survive, but the full green determination of something that has decided in favor of living. Cecily had gone to look, and she had been standing in the garden with her hand around one of the new canes, feeling the firmness of it, when she heard the door from the south terrace open and close. Edmund stood at the top of the terrace steps. He looked at the roses. He looked at her hand on the new cane. He came down 3 steps and then stopped. Briggs said they were coming on, he said. He was right. Edmund came down the remaining steps. He stopped at the edge of the bed, close enough that they were standing perhaps 4 feet apart, the closest they had been outside of a doorway since the wedding. He looked at the roses for a long time. Then he looked at her, and for a moment his hand moved from his side toward her, toward the roses, toward both. And he said, almost, they were her. And then he stopped. He said instead, they look well. She said, they will be better by June. He nodded. He went back inside. But he had come down the steps. The month of April brought a letter from Lady Penmore, whom Cecily had met once at the subscription meeting, and who had written, with what seemed to be genuine warmth rather than social obligation, to invite them both to a dinner in Bath in the 2nd week of May. Cecily had been sitting with Edmund in the library when she showed him the letter, which she did not usually do with correspondence, but which seemed to require his input rather than her decision alone. He read it in his rapid way and set it down. He said, "Do you wish to go?" She considered this. She said, "I think it might be useful. For the school programme, Lady Penmore has some influence with the parish council in her district." He looked at her. He said, "That is not what I asked." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the library window, the garden was showing the first firm green of the season. The roses had leafed out properly, long healthy canes, with the close packed green of genuine growth, rather than the desperate stretching of a plant in distress. She said, "I think, yes, I would like to go." He nodded once. He wrote the acceptance himself, which she had not expected. It was 3 lines, which was 2 lines more than his usual correspondence. The dinner in Bath was not, in the end, remarkable in itself. It was the usual architecture of a dinner of 12 people who mostly knew each other, and one couple whom several of them had opinions about without having met. Cecily had expected to feel observed, and she was not wrong, but she had also expected to feel diminished by the observation, and she was wrong about that. She had spent the preceding months managing a household of 40, negotiating with tradespeople, corresponding with 3 separate charitable organizations, and reading, on alternate evenings, the complete works of 3 different natural historians whose annotations she had found in the library. She discovered, not easily diminished. She sat beside a Mr. Darwell from Somerset, who was interested in agricultural reform, and who had been surprised when she engaged with his position with what he later described to his wife as a troubling degree of specificity. On her other side was a Mrs. Penrose, who had opinions on the education of rural children, and who departed the dinner with the name of the Ashverne school's headmaster in her notebook, and a promise to write to the parish council the following week. Edmund, from across the table, had watched this with the expression of a man who is revising an assumption he had not known he was making. On the carriage home, he said, "You did not find it uncomfortable." "The dinner?" She looked at him. "No. Did you expect me to?" "I had thought." He stopped. He looked out the window. The road was dark, and the carriage lamps made a small moving circle of light around them. "I had thought you might find the company of strangers difficult," she said. "I find strangers considerably easier than people who have decided what they think of me before I arrive." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I made that mistake also." She turned to look at him. He was still looking out the window, but the line of his jaw had changed, softened by some fraction of a degree. "The way stone softens at the edge when water has been at it long enough," she said, "I know." He looked at her then. Not for long, 4 seconds, perhaps 5. Then back to the window. But in those seconds, something had been acknowledged that had not been acknowledged before, and the carriage rolled on through the dark, with the lamps making their small circle and both of them inside it. The season in London was, that year, a matter about which Edmund had made clear he had no interest whatsoever. He had not attended a London season in 2 years, and he had communicated his continued disinterest through his solicitor's office in December. It was therefore something of a surprise to everyone, including Cecily, when he appeared in the morning room in the first week of May and said, in his direct and abbreviated way, "There is the Blackmore ball on the 14th. I have been asked to attend. I believe it is time." Cecily looked up from her correspondence. Her pen stilled. "I would like you to accompany me," he said. It was not a question, but it was also not entirely the statement it was pretending to be. "Of course," she said. She wore to the Blackmore ball a gown of deep blue silk that she had made herself over the course of 3 weeks, working in the evenings in the small sitting room off the library. The silk had been a wedding gift from Edmund's housekeeper, a length that had been left over from the making of curtains for the refurbished morning room, and which the housekeeper had pressed upon her with a gruffness that was, Cecily had come to understand, the woman's primary mode of warmth. The gown was not fashionable in the London manner. It was too simple for that, without the ornamental excess that was currently in vogue, but it was made with great care, and it fit precisely, and it was the colour of deep water in afternoon light. She carried her mother's thimble in her reticule. This was a habit she had maintained since she was 16, a small brass thimble worn smooth at the rim, with a dent on one side where it had been dropped on a flagstone floor 40 years ago, when it belonged to a woman who no longer needed it. The dent had been there before Cecily was born. Her mother had pressed it into her hand the morning she left for Ashverne, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the object did not already say better. The Blackmore ball was the first major gathering of the season, and it was consequently very full, very hot, and very loud. There were 400 people in the main rooms, and the orchestra was playing something Cecily did not recognize, and the candles were all lit, and the light was enormous and merciless, and entirely without shadow. She stood beside Edmund as he exchanged the first civil words he had exchanged in this company for 2 years, and she watched how the room recalibrated itself around him, how the attention shifted, and the conversations tilted, and the social geometry of the entire assembly reorganized itself with Ashverne at the centre. She also watched, from across 3 rows of people, as Dorothea Holt arrived. Dorothea had come with a party of 6, the Rutherfords, a Lady Penmore, a Mr. and Mrs. Ashby from Bath, and she moved through the room with the efficiency of a general who has identified the key point of battle. She stopped twice to speak, quietly, to groups of people who subsequently looked in Cecily's direction. Cecily noted both of these moments. She did not look away. She was standing with Mrs. Blackmore and a Miss Farwell near the east window when she heard it clearly for the first time. Not whispered, but said in a conversational register that was perhaps a single decibel louder than discretion required. It came from Dorothea's direction, and it passed through the immediate company like a current. One cannot help but feel for Ashverne. He has done his duty by the girl, certainly, but one can see he is carrying the whole weight of the thing alone. She has no idea how to move in this company. Very much the charity case made good, as far as it goes. The room did not go silent, but there was a particular quality of listening that fell over the 8 or 10 people nearest to where Cecily stood. The way people go still when they are watching an animal they are not sure is wounded or merely resting. Cecily did not move. Her chin came up by half an inch. Her hand, inside her reticule, found the thimble by feel and held it. Not gripping, simply holding, the way one holds something that has its own weight and history. 1 second. 2, 3, 4, 5. Then Edmund was beside her. She had not seen him cross the room. He was simply there, at her shoulder, turned slightly, so that his body was half between her and the room. Not shielding her, but positioned in a way that said, without theatrical declaration, that he had chosen where he was standing. He said, in a voice that carried without being raised, in the particular register of a man who is accustomed to rooms listening to him and sees no reason to shout to achieve it, I wonder, Lady Holt, whether you have yet had the opportunity to speak with Mr. Cartwell about the village school subscription. The room paused. Dorothea turned. She had not expected him to be so close, or to address her so directly, and her expression, for 2 seconds, 2 full seconds, measurable, came apart in a way that revealed something underneath the composure. Not malice, but fear. A very specific fear. The kind that belongs to a person who has built their significance on proximity to someone else's greatness, and has seen that edifice crack, and understands they cannot replace the person who stood at its center. For 2 seconds, Dorothea Holt was simply a woman who had loved her friend and lost her, and did not know what she was without her. Then, the expression reassembled, piece by piece, with a skill that had taken years to learn. Your Grace, she said. I am not certain the subscription, Edmund said, still in that carrying voice, was organized by my wife. She began the correspondence in January, and she resolved 3 separate disputes between the school board and the parish in February, which I understand had been unresolved for 2 years before her arrival. She did this without being asked, and without informing me until it was completed. Because she does not require recognition in order to act. He paused for exactly the time it takes to draw one breath. I am told by Briggs, my head gardener, that she also brought 4 rose beds back from complete neglect in a single winter. He says, and I quote him precisely, that she asked the right questions and did not flinch. The room was very still. Edmund's voice did not change in volume or register. He said, my wife is not a charity case. I am the one who benefited from this arrangement. I had forgotten, in the preceding 18 months, what it looks like when a house is properly inhabited. I owe her that re-education. 1 second. 2, 3. Then he said, and this was quiet enough that only those nearest could hear it, and they would hear it exactly, and they would repeat it exactly. Because this was the kind of sentence that does not change in the repetition, I am also, and I recognize this may surprise several people in this room, very much in love with her. This surprised me too. I did not expect it, and I did not plan for it, and I find it, on the whole, entirely necessary. He turned to Cecily. The room fell away around them the way rooms do in such moments, when two people inside them have reached a point of gravity that makes the surrounding furniture irrelevant. She was looking at him. Her hand was still around the thimble in her reticule. Her eyes were the colour of river water, and in the light of 400 candles, there were no shadows in them at all. She said, very quietly, "You might have told me that at Ashverne." He said, "I know. We could have avoided an extremely hot ballroom." Almost, and then finally, fully, with the completeness of a thing that has been rehearsed in increments until the moment it happens naturally, he smiled. It was not large. It transformed nothing dramatically. It was simply the smile of a man who has given himself permission to feel something, and has found that the feeling, on arrival, is not nearly as frightening as its absence. He said, "I will tell you again at Ashverne, as many times as required." On the other side of the room, Dorothea Holt stood very still. Her face had been put back together, as it always was, but something in it was different now. Not broken, but changed. As if the assembling had been done with pieces that did not entirely fit the old shape, and she knew it, and she was beginning, just beginning, to consider that the old shape might not have been the right one. Cecily found her, 10 minutes later, near the door to the east corridor. She crossed to her not with the intention of confrontation, and not with the intention of forgiveness. Forgiveness was not the right word for what she had to offer. She simply crossed the room and stopped beside her and said, "The school will need a patron for its reading program in the autumn. I am writing to several families to ask their participation. I would be glad to include your name, if you were willing." Dorothea looked at her. Her chin was very high. Then it lowered, by a fraction. "I was fond of her," Dorothea said. Not by way of explanation, just as a fact. "I know," Cecily said. "That is not a reason not to speak to me." She left the door open. Whether Dorothea walked through it would be Dorothea's choice. They left the ball at 11:30, which was earlier than convention suggested, and earlier than Edmund had planned. He handed her into the carriage, and he sat across from her, and for the first 7 miles he said nothing, which was not unusual. But somewhere in the 8th mile, in the dark between the last village and the lane that led to Ashverne, he said, "The roses. On the south wall. I want you to know that I am glad you asked about them. I would not have known how to ask myself." She said, "I know." He said, "Catherine would have liked that. She would not have wanted the garden to close." Cecily looked out the window at the dark. She said, "It will be beautiful by June." He said, "Yes." The carriage moved through the gate and up the drive, and the house appeared through the trees as it always did. The long pale stone, the windows, the chimneys. She counted, by habit, from the habit of the first morning she arrived. 3 chimneys smoking tonight. She had not noticed when it had become 3. But there it was, 3 threads rising in the cold April dark, small and warm and alive. In her reticule, the brass thimble was warm from her hand. The autumn came in gently that year, the way good things sometimes do, without announcement, without drama, arriving simply in the colour of the leaves on the oaks, along the drive, and the angle of the afternoon light on the south terrace, and the smell in the library of wood smoke and old paper, and something that had not been there before, which was simply the smell of a house that was being lived in. It was September, which made it 9 months. 9 months since a hired coach had come up the drive, and a woman in a grey dress with a turned collar had stood in the library doorway and taken the measure of the room before she entered it. The dress was long since replaced. The house had, in the accounting of the housekeeper, lit 5 chimneys through the August heat. Not because they needed them, but because there were people in enough of the rooms to warrant them. The east wing was still closed. But the door at the end of the first-floor corridor, the room with the good east light, was open most mornings. The portrait hung there, and Catherine Hartwell looked out from it with her warm mouth and her direct eyes at a room that was regularly dusted and sometimes had flowers in it from the garden, because Cecily had asked if she might put them there, and Edmund had said yes. In the library, the long table had been drawn in from its full extension. It could seat 6 comfortably now. Cecily's books were on 3 shelves of the east wall. On the edge of Edmund's desk, every morning, there was a cup of tea. She was in the rose garden in the last week of September when she heard the door. The beds along the south wall were in their autumn state. The second flowering was done, and the hips were forming, small and red and full, and the canes that had been trained and tied along the wall through the spring and summer had grown into something that was visibly a garden and not a wilderness. Briggs was working at the far end with his usual economy of movement, and the afternoon was warm for the time of year, and the light was coming in at a low angle that made everything it touched look slightly more itself than usual. Edmund came down the terrace steps. He did not stop at the edge this time. He walked into the garden across the grass, and he came to stand beside her at the wall where the tallest of the rose canes had been trained, and he was close enough that she could have taken his hand without reaching. She did not reach. She waited. He said, "I told Briggs these should be catalogued." The variety names. He says he doesn't know half of them anymore. She said, "There are books in the library on rose varieties. I found them on the 4th shelf on the left." He said, "Of course there are." She looked at him. He was looking at the roses, but his expression, she had learned to read his expressions in the precise way one learns to read a landscape, by knowing where the light usually falls and noticing where it has changed. He looked, she thought, like a man who is not afraid of the thing in front of him. He took her hand. He did not announce it. He simply did what he had almost done in the spring, 3 times, with the incremental progress of a man learning a skill he should have had years ago. He took her hand at the wrist and turned it slightly and held it, and she turned her palm up because it seemed the right answer, and they stood in the garden with the rose hips red around them, and the light coming in low and warm and without shadow. "I did not expect you," he said, "to be necessary." She said, "I know. I did not expect Ashverne. Is it enough?" She was quiet for a moment. The thimble was in her pocket. She carried it there now, rather than in the reticule, a smaller and more immediate form of carrying. She did not reach for it. She said, "It is more than enough." He raised her hand and held it, briefly, against his chest, and she felt the warmth of him there, and the slow steadiness of his breathing, and the garden was full of afternoon light, and the smell of the last roses, and the sound, faint and very far, of Briggs working at the far end with the steady quiet of a man who has decided something is worth the effort, and has gotten on with it. The brass thimble in her pocket was warm from her body. It had a dent on one side, where it had been dropped on a flagstone floor 40 years ago. It was the same thimble it had always been. The same dent, the same worn rim. but on the shelf in the library, in a small pewter dish that Edmund had found in the study and set there without comment. It would rest tonight beside a rose-hip that Cecily had cut from the south wall, the first fully open flower of the second bloom, which Briggs had brought in that morning and laid on the slate of the terrace step as a kind of report. She had placed it in the dish herself. She had not told Edmund. She had simply done it. Some things do not require announcement. At the north end of the house, in the morning room where the accounts were kept and the correspondence was managed, and a fire was lit every morning at 7 o'clock, because the Duchess preferred to begin her work early, there was a letter half written on the desk. It was addressed to Lady Dorothea Holt, and it was, in its second paragraph, an invitation to the school's autumn reading programme, which was to be held in November, which would need several readers and a patron, and which Cecily had been organising with the schoolmaster since June. She had not sent it yet. She would send it tomorrow. Whether Dorothea would come through the door was still Dorothea's choice. In the library, 5 candles were lit. Edmund had lit the 5th one himself. He was reading something, or appearing to read something, and Cecily was in her chair at the window end, with a book, and the fire was burning behind them both, and the room was warm, and neither of them was required to be anywhere else. Outside, on the south terrace, the last light was leaving the rose garden, the long gold afternoon pulling itself gradually back over the horizon, and the house stood in the cooling evening with 5 chimneys smoking. 5. Now, it had been 5 for some time. Some things install themselves so quietly in a household that no one can say exactly when they began. Thank you for listening to this story all the way until the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from today and what this story made you feel in your heart. Do not forget to subscribe so you will never miss a new story.